Welcome back to the deep dive. We spend a lot of time on this show analyzing these really complex documents, market trends, historical pivots,
All big picture stuff.
all the big picture stuff. But today, we're focusing on something that is, well, it's intensely personal, but it's also almost universally experienced.
Right.
We're talking about the profound and I think often paralyzing struggle of learning English as an adult, and specifically the emotional toll it takes.
It's not really a skill deficit we're analyzing today, is it?
Yeah.
It's a feeling.
Exactly. A feeling.
Yeah, and we took a deep look at the sources you share with us, and it was a stack just heavily focused on the psychology of it all, the cognitive science behind adult language acquisition. And the one theme that just kept coming up again and again was this intense sense of inadequacy.
Not just difficulty.
No, not at all. It was more than that. It was this internalized shame, this feeling of being stupid or less than just because the words don't come out with the speed or, the nuance that you want.
Yes. That's the paradox, isn't it? The one at the heart of this whole deep dive.
It's so striking.
Because we are talking about highly accomplished individuals. I mean, engineers, senior managers, researchers, academics.
Brilliant people.
Yeah.
People who are incredibly articulate and often really witty in their native tongue.
And they report almost universally the same thing. Something like, I feel like my brain shrinks when I speak English, or I feel stupid when I open my mouth even though I understand everything perfectly.
And that's our mission today, right?
That's the mission, to unpack that disconnect. We really need to define why that gap between your rich, complex inner world and the simple, sometimes grammatically flawed sentences you produce is just so profoundly frustrating.
And I think we have to start with just immediate validation.
Okay.
If you're listening to this, what you're experiencing, that gut-wrenching insecurity, it is not a sign of intellectual failure. The sources make this crystal clear.
Yeah.
This feeling is not a reflection of your true intelligence or your capacity to learn.
It's an emotional struggle.
It's an emotional struggle rooted in this incredible vulnerability and a temporary restriction of your tools.
Okay.
And just recognizing that distinction, I think, is essential.
Why is it so essential?
Because that feeling of inadequacy is the biggest mental barrier a high-achieving learner faces. It stops them from speaking, which then stops them from practicing.
Yeah.
And, well, you get this vicious cycle.
That distinction, emotional vulnerability versus intellectual failure, that's the line we need to hold on to throughout this whole conversation.
Absolutely.
Okay, let's unpack this. Let's get right into the cognitive nuts and bolts of the problem. We're going to spend a good amount of time looking at why that gap between your intricate thoughts and your simple sentences feels so devastating. And crucially, we're going to use the latest research to prove why having this temporary feeling of inadequacy is actually, a powerful signal of courageous and active learning. All right, let's start with the cognitive core of the pain, which is really that disconnect. Just think for a moment about your identity in your native language. You're L1. You're capable, you're articulate, you're witty, you handle these complex concepts, you understand subtle nuance, you can use irony and sarcasm flawlessly.
And you can switch registers, right?
Right.
From super formal to deeply personal without even thinking about it.
Exactly. That identity is built on decades of just effortless linguistic output.
And that L1 articulateness is so tied directly to your sense of self-worth,
Yeah.
to your intellectual standing in the world. Now, you open your mouth in English, you're L2, and suddenly that whole sophisticated identity, it feels like it just crumbles.
It just disappears.
Yeah, and the sources capture this perfectly. They note that a capable adult is suddenly struggling to articulate even simple ideas. And that is jarring.
Jarring because your self-perception hasn't changed, right? You know you're smart.
Exactly. You know you are.
Yeah.
But the external expression becomes rudimentary.
And that clash, that's what we're calling the vulnerability vortex. You're just so exposed because the language system you have available can't possibly present the full, sophisticated adult version of you.
And the most painful part of this, the part that really triggers that deep internalized shame, is exactly what the learners report.
Which is?
The feeling of suddenly sounding like a child again. It's this profound cognitive dissonance.
I mean, your brain is operating at an adult level, isn't it? You're managing complex finances, you're solving technical problems, you're interpreting dense articles.
But your language output is halting or juvenile or just overly simplified. And that massive gap, that's it. That is the absolute measurable root of feeling stupid.
It's fascinating because the intelligence isn't just about what you know, it's about how fast you can access it and deploy it.
Right.
In your native language, that path from a thought to your mouth it's instantaneous, it's automatic, it's highly efficient.
But in English,
In English, that path is riddled with construction sites and detours.
that's the key distinction. And this is where we need to go beyond just simple analogies. We need to talk about working memory.
Okay, explain that.
So when you speak your L1, your working memory, that's the mental space where you temporarily hold information to process it. It's free. It's free to focus on meaning, on strategy. You're thinking about your argument or your tone or how the listener is reacting.
But when you switch to L2 to English, that working memory gets immediately hijacked.
Precisely. The research is very clear on this. L2 learners spend enormous cognitive resources on just retrieval speed and grammar monitoring.
So you're thinking at the same time.
You're thinking simultaneously. What's the right word here? Is this verb tense correct? Do I use for or since?
No.
Yeah.
Wow.
And that internal processing, it takes up so much of your working memory that there's just very little bandwidth left over for constructing nuanced ideas or expressing subtle irony.
So the limited output is a function of cognitive resource depletion.
Yes, it's not a flaw in your baseline intelligence. Struggling to express yourself in English does not in any way equate to a lack of intelligence.
So if I'm understanding the sources correctly, the intelligence is still there, it's operating at full capacity. But the delivery system for getting that intelligence out into the world, it's just overloaded.
Exactly.
It's kind of like trying to run a 4K streaming video on an old dial-up internet connection.
That's a much more specific analogy than the usual supercar one we hear.
Well, it feels right. The source material is perfect, but the transmission rate is disastrously slow.
That's it. You're trying to transmit a high-definition idea through a low-resolution channel, limited vocabulary, uncertain syntax. It all forces you to produce only simple sentences.
And not because you're dumb.
Not at all. It's because you're communicating with a restricted toolkit that is also, simultaneously, demanding really high maintenance. It's like you're trying to build this complex argument, but you have to stop every 10 seconds to check if the hammer you're holding is the right size.
That constant internal checking, that self-monitoring, that has to be what makes the experience so exhausting and painful.
It is.
Because the learner is acutely aware of the superior sentence they could have built in their own language. They can hear it, right?
Yes, they hear the complicated, nuanced, effortless phrase in their head. But when it comes out in English, it's maybe 5 simple words, and potentially even grammatically flawed. It's that constant internal comparison against L1 perfection that just wears them down.
And there's more going on in the brain too, isn't there?
Oh, yes. What's really fascinating here is a concept called lexical access competition.
Lexical access. What now?
Competition. So in your second language, when you search for a word, your brain doesn't just pull up the English translation. It retrieves the word in your native language and any other language you know. And that creates this huge mental traffic jam.
So it's not a clean search?
Not at all. Your brain has to actively inhibit or suppress the stronger L1 vocabulary before the weaker L2 word can be successfully produced. And this inhibition process is cognitively expensive. It directly contributes to that feeling of slowness or stupidity.
Wow.
So the struggle you feel is the sound of your brain winning a micro battle against your dominant language system.
So the slowness isn't hesitation. It's internal suppression and conflict resolution happening hundreds of times a minute.
Exactly. The fact that you successfully produce the L2 word at all is actually proof of high-level cognitive filtering.
That's amazing.
And that observation from the student in one of the sources, that learning a new language brings us down to a baby's level again, it just perfectly captures the psychological weight of this transition.
For a capable adult, being functionally relegated to a state of linguistic childhood has to be profoundly uncomfortable.
It is. They're interpreting a temporary, necessary reduction in their expressive skill as a permanent global reduction in their intellectual ability.
Okay, but let me challenge that for a moment.
Go ahead.
Because this is what a highly motivated listener might be thinking. If I'm feeling stupid because my vocabulary is limited, isn't the solution just to study harder? Doesn't saying it's just a restricted toolkit remove the urgency to, refine my grammar and expand my output?
That's a really important question. And it speaks to the difference between competence and performance. You absolutely must study hard to increase your competence, your knowledge base of vocabulary and grammar rules. But what we're talking about here is performance under pressure. And that's affected by anxiety and cognitive load.
So you might know the words, but you can't get to them.
right? You might know 5,000 words, but under the pressure of a meeting, because of working memory overload and that lexical competition, you can only access 500 of them. The feeling of inadequacy stems from the gap between your known competence and your current restricted performance. And it's that gap we're trying to close with these psychological strategies.
So the intellectual tools are there, but they're kind of stuck in the brain's high security storage, and the retrieval process is just painfully slow,
That's a perfect way to put it.
which makes the whole process feel so much less like a simple academic problem and much more like, I don't know, a high wire act. You know how to walk the wire, that's your complex thought. But the basic safety net, your limited, effortful English, is so tenuous that the entire performance feels agonizingly risky and exposes all your flaws.
And that inability to match sophisticated internal thought to equally sophisticated external expression is precisely why the frustration feels so strictly emotional and not just intellectual. In fact, the fact that you do notice the gap,
Yeah.
the fact that you can hear the difference between the thought in your head and the sentence you just spoke, that's actually the definitive, undeniable proof that your intelligence remains intact and highly active.
So the critic is working perfectly.
Your sophisticated self-monitoring is what's causing the pain, but it's also the mechanism that will drive you to eventual mastery.
That is a crucial reframing. The internal critic that tells you, ugh, that was too simple, is actually functioning perfectly.
It is. It's just using a frustrating metric,
Yeah.
the automatic perfection of your L1 to measure your L2 performance.
We have to continually remind ourselves, and you, the listener, that this is a temporary restriction on output. It's not a flaw in the input or the processing unit.
And as we move forward, we need to focus on how this restriction on output, this feeling of having a temporary mental muzzle, starts to interact with the external world.
Because that's when it gets really hard.
That's when the emotional crucible really starts to heat up.
Mm.
It transitions from a personal cognitive difficulty to the very public fear of judgment.
Okay, so this transition from the cognitive difficulty we just laid out to the acute emotional pain. This is where the true resilience of the learner is tested. And this is where it gets really interesting. Because speaking a new language makes you profoundly vulnerable. And vulnerability in a high-stakes environment is not just exhausting, it's paralyzing.
It is paralyzing.
Hmm.
It's paralyzing because every single utterance, every choice of word, every single pronunciation, it becomes a high-stakes gamble.
Every time you open your mouth.
Every time. In a professional or social setting, you risk making an observable mistake. It's not just a private cognitive process anymore. It becomes this ongoing public emotional exposure. And the sources confirm that this constant exposure is what feeds that deep, intense fear.
And the fear is not just about, getting a grammar rule wrong. The fear is rooted in profound judgment. The core worry is that listeners might think you are foolish or incompetent or just unintelligent purely due to an error, a grammar slip, or even a strong accent.
And this pervasive fear, it turns a simple conversation into an emotional battlefield where the perceived stakes are exponentially higher than the actual stakes.
Let's talk about those perceived stakes, because this feels particularly acute for our audience of, highly capable professionals.
It really is. I mean, think about it.
Yeah.
If a native speaker mispronounces a word, it's just a slip. No one cares.
Right.
But if the L2 learner mispronounces a word in a high-stakes context, say they're presenting data to a client, the fear is that the listener assigns that error not to the language skill, but to the speaker's overall competence.
Or worse, their credibility.
Exactly. And that feeling of potential negative judgment is internalized with every single syllable they utter.
And this fear, it's not just some kind of internal paranoia, right? The research actually contextualizes this.
It does. It contextualizes this fear within broader findings on what is formally called foreign language anxiety, or FLA.
FLA.
Yeah, and this anxiety is so pervasive and statistically significant that it's a recognized academic concept,
Yeah.
which just demonstrates that the experience is nearly universal among L2 learners.
So we have to emphasize this.
We must. If you're listening right now and you're feeling that intense self-consciousness, maybe you're sweating before a presentation or you're actively avoiding social situations where you have to speak English.
And we're not alone.
You are statistically normal. You are part of a massive group of people experiencing a predictable psychological response to this very challenging situation.
So what does the research tell us about the specific behaviors that are driven by this FLA?
Well, the symptoms are often behavioral, things like active avoidance,
Like what?
Not asking questions in class or in meetings, opting out of speaking roles entirely, or sticking only to pre-prepared scripts that you've memorized.
So you never go off script.
Never. And cognitively, FLA can manifest as a racing mind, or just blanking out when you're called upon to speak spontaneously. The studies show that learners often feel very self-conscious about speaking in front of other students, or, and this is the most acute, in front of authority figures, bosses, teachers.
And the comparison game.
Oh, the comparison trap is a huge part of the problem. They frequently worry that others speak better than they do, and that comparison powerfully reinforces those initial feelings of inadequacy.
Right. We look around and maybe we see other non-native speakers who seem effortlessly fluent, and our internal metric just starts grading us so harshly against them. How can we reframe that competitive anxiety?
I think the critical intervention is just normalizing it, recognizing it's part of the process. It requires immense bravery to speak under those conditions,
Yeah.
especially when your cognitive resources are already so depleted from the effort.
So the anxiety is just a sign of the effort.
Exactly. That anxiety is the brain's natural, albeit counterproductive defense mechanism against perceived judgment. The way to overcome it is to treat that feeling of anxiety not as a personal failure, but as an indicator of the high effort you are exerting.
I think we need to dedicate some real time to the source of the fear itself, the actual external judgment.
Okay.
Because the core fear is they are judging me for my errors. How do we effectively equip you, the listener, with a cognitive shield against that?
We start by reality checking the perception.
Okay.
The sources suggest that in truth, most people, especially in professional settings, are far more understanding than the learner imagines.
So we're harder on ourselves than others are.
Much harder.
Yeah.
The native speaker usually recognizes the immense effort involved and, having benefited from decades of automatic fluency, they often feel a basic level of patience and appreciation for the effort being shown.
But then why is our imagination so punitive? Why do we assume the worst from people?
It's the projection of the internal hypercritic. Since you notice every single mistake you make, the delayed word, the incorrect article, the awkward construction, you just assume everyone else notices them with the same surgical precision.
But they don't.
In reality, no. The listener is generally focused on the message, not the imperfect delivery system. Unless the error causes a complete communicative breakdown, a native speaker's brain is naturally filtering, correcting, and overlooking minor grammatical flaws to get to the intended meaning.
Their goal is understanding, not grading.
Exactly. Their goal is understanding.
That's a good starting point, but let's address the reality of negative judgment. Because we can't ignore those times when the learner encounters true rudeness, or impatience, or explicit condescension.
No, we can't. It happens.
So how does the source provide a powerful reframing mechanism for those moments?
This is where the emotional shield becomes absolutely essential. If someone does judge you for your errors, if they're rude or dismissive or make you feel inferior about your accent, that reflects entirely on their character and their narrow-mindedness. It says nothing about your intelligence or your effort.
That is the essential insight that needs to sink in. When you are communicating an idea and the listener focuses on your accent or your grammar instead of your effort or the content of your intelligence.
They're demonstrating a critical failure of empathy.
Right. They're revealing their own limited worldview, not your deficiencies.
And this insight is so empowering because it helps shift the emotional responsibility away from you, the learner.
So you move from internalizing it to externalizing it.
Precisely. You move from internalizing the critique, I am dumb, I fail to speak perfectly, to externalizing the poor behavior. They are judgmental, and their opinion about my temporary difficulty is completely irrelevant.
So how does the learner practically deploy that shield, like in the middle of a conversation? Say a colleague sighs impatiently or, corrects your grammar unnecessarily in a meeting. What's the immediate internal dialogue that helps maintain your equilibrium?
The internal dialogue needs to be an assertion of your effort and your value. When you're faced with that condescension, you should mentally state, I am having a high-stakes conversation in a second language right now. My colleague is being impatient in their only language.
I like that.
My effort far exceeds theirs, and their rudeness is a distraction from the valuable contribution I am making.
So you take the judgment, you analyze its source, and you recognize it as a weakness in the listener, not in yourself.
Exactly.
The moment you can genuinely adopt that mindset, the emotional crucible loses its power, doesn't it?
It really does.
The conversation shifts from, oh no, I made a mistake, I'm inadequate, to, wow, I just demonstrated incredible courage by communicating complex ideas in a language that is not my own. And if they can't appreciate that effort, their opinion carries zero intellectual weight for me.
That is the turning point for persistence. When you feel that hot sting of shame, you need to recognize that shame is the emotional response to a perceived intellectual failure. By separating the temporary linguistic limitation from your permanent intellectual value, the emotional sting is greatly reduced and that paralysis begins to lift.
It's about regaining control over the emotional response, which I think leads us directly into how we can cement this new powerful frame, the understanding that this feeling of difficulty is not a definition of you. It's an indicator of powerful, effective progress.
So we've established that the feeling of inadequacy comes from this vulnerability gap and the fear of judgment, and it's all exacerbated by cognitive overload.
Right.
Now we move to the solution, the mental reframe, one that's rooted in the reality of the learning process itself. We need to shift the focus entirely from judging performance failure to celebrating courageous effort.
And the source material provides the core tenet of this mindset. It's that feeling unsure or even feeling dumb is actually a key sign that you are actively pushing your linguistic boundaries and learning.
It is. If you're comfortable, you are stagnating. The discomfort, that feeling of struggle, is literally the sensation of your brain expanding new neural pathways.
Think about it physiologically.
Yes. That feeling of, this is hard, I feel slow, is the sensory manifestation of two things. First, the high metabolic cost of code switching.
So it's literally burning more energy.
A lot more. And second, it's the creation of those new, non-optimized connections. L2 communication demands significantly more glucose and oxygen than L1 use, which is why people often feel physically exhausted after a long day of speaking English.
So the feeling of slowness isn't a delusion.
Not at all. It's a symptom of your brain working overtime. That exhaustion is proof of effort.
So the mental switch should be immediate. The moment you feel that old, paralyzing feeling creeping in, the insecurity, the shame, the mental fatigue, you should be able to instantly recognize it as a signal.
The signal should be, good. My brain is in high metabolic growth mode. I'm learning something new. I am in the zone of actual growth.
I love that. The zone of actual growth.
Exactly. And this uncomfortable period is a temporary phase in the learning process. It often feels nonlinear.
What do you mean by that?
You might experience plateaus or even brief periods where you feel like you're regressing. Researchers actually call this the U-shaped learning curve.
So you get worse before you get better.
Sometimes. But the underlying exposure is building the complex neural infrastructure you need for future fluency. Every awkward conversation, every stumble over a verb is a step toward closing that gap.
So it sounds like what we're asking for is fierce self-compassion for the awkwardness of the process.
We are.
But we can back that compassion up with cold, hard, logical evidence of your existing intellectual capacity.
Absolutely. We need to reinforce the core message with the ultimate proof of intelligence, the fact that you already possess the fundamental intelligence needed for mastery.
And we use their L1 acquisition as the evidence.
As undeniable evidence against the feeling of being stupid, the ultimate proof is this. You managed to learn your native language to an incredibly high level.
Which is not easy.
It's an incredibly complex system, full of exceptions, nuance, deep cultural context. That accomplishment alone required you to master abstract reasoning, statistical probability, just to predict word placement, and complex motor skills for articulation.
So if you did that,
you clearly have the inherent intelligence required to master another language system, period.
let's just pause there for a moment and really consider the complexity of L1 acquisition that we totally take for granted.
Please.
We're talking about a child over just a few years mastering phonetics, morphosyntax, semantics, pragmatics, all while integrating this deep cultural knowledge. It is an extraordinary feat of intelligence. It's like solving thousands of complex linguistic puzzles subconsciously.
It is.
So the fact that you, the listener, have already accomplished this once is the best possible reassurance you can receive. The engine works perfectly.
And that engine, that cognitive capacity, it remains fully functional. The current struggle isn't about capacity. It's about bandwidth and retrieval speed, like we talked about with working memory and lexical access.
It's an optimization problem.
It's an optimization problem. Your native language has been optimized over decades for instantaneous, high-fidelity communication through constant use and positive reinforcement. English is still in the long, arduous optimization process.
So you have to give the brain time.
You have to give the brain time to automate the new rules, and the speed will catch up to the intelligence.
But I want to focus on the high-achieving mindset that's so common among our listeners.
Mm.
Often, these are people who are used to rapid mastery in their professional fields. They might feel exceptional frustration because their progress in English isn't linear or it doesn't match the expectations they've set from success in other, more technical disciplines.
That expectation misalignment is critical to address. Technical fields often reward a fixed mindset, right?
Yeah.
You memorize the rules, you follow the procedure, you get a predictable result.
Language isn't like that.
Not at all. Language acquisition is inherently messy, it's human, and it requires a growth mindset. It demands that you accept failure and awkwardness as necessary inputs for success. The sources confirm that the learners who can accept that they will sound stupid for a while are the ones who persist and eventually achieve fluency.
They separate their identity from their immediate output.
They do.
Okay, so this brings us to the most practical application of this deep dive, the mantra for adjustment. We need to give the listener a powerful, deployable, mental counter-strategy to interrupt that emotional loop the moment the feeling of shame or inadequacy strikes.
The core mantra has to be simple, logical, and undeniable.
Which is?
The feeling of stupid is a feeling, not a fact. It is a temporary state of being, not a definition of who you are. The moment that feeling strikes, you need an active intellectual self-defense to reassert control.
And how does the source suggest they structure that self-defense?
Whenever this feeling strikes, the learner should remind themselves of the core truth we extracted. I have complex thoughts. The struggle is English, not me.
I have complex thoughts. The struggle is English, not me.
It's an assertion of intellectual identity that transcends the current linguistic limitation. You're saying, my ability to conceptualize remains stellar, even if my ability to articulate that concept is currently under construction.
It shifts the blame, or rather the emotional burden, from the person to the technical challenge inherent in the learning curve.
Exactly.
You're essentially telling your internal critic, this isn't a moral or intellectual failure. This is a software update that is taking a little longer than expected.
And that separation is absolutely vital for persistence and for avoiding burnout. If you continually internalize the linguistic difficulty as an intellectual failing, you will eventually quit. The emotional cost just becomes unsustainable.
But if you can see it as a technical challenge,
If you can view the difficulty as a solvable technical challenge, the need for more robust lexical retrieval, the refinement of a specific grammar rule, it remains manageable. And your inherent intelligence becomes your greatest ally in solving that technical problem.
so the ultimate goal here is to reframe intense discomfort. It is not a signal to stop.
It's a confirmation that the hard, necessary work of neurological reorganization is successfully underway.
So that feeling of being down to a baby's level is an unavoidable stage of adult linguistic rebirth.
And this reframing is key because the moment you stop fearing the feeling of being stupid, you start using that feeling as a motivational marker for growth. It becomes proof that you are pushing the boundary, not that you have hit a wall.
So let's bring this deep dive home. We started by validating that intensely common and painful experience, feeling inadequate or stupid when communicating in English. And we've established that this feeling stems from two highly specific, understandable cognitive and emotional sources. First, the cognitive overload and the temporary tool limitation.
Right, that restricted working memory and slow retrieval speed that just prevents sophisticated thoughts from being fully expressed.
And second, that deep emotional vulnerability of constant public exposure.
Which is exacerbated by foreign language anxiety, or FLA.
Right.
And crucially, we have emphasized that this anxiety is normal.
You are not alone.
Not at all, and is a feature of the process, not a flaw in your intelligence. Your intelligence is fully proven by your mastery of your native language.
And the pain you feel.
The pain you feel is simply your sophisticated internal monitor recognizing the temporary gap between your intellectual potential and your current output performance.
Okay, so the final instruction for you, the learner, the thing to take away when you leave this conversation and head into your next challenging English interaction. When that paralyzing feeling of inadequacy strikes, what is the mindset shift that provides the most immediate relief and encouragement?
The immediate relief comes from changing your perspective on the struggle. This is the act of courage. The final, powerful instruction is to wear that temporary beginner feeling as a badge of courage. It means you're learning.
A badge of courage.
Yes. Every single time you open your mouth in a second language, you are demonstrating bravery and exerting massive cognitive effort, far beyond what is required of a native speaker. That in itself is a massive accomplishment that should never, ever be discounted.
That's the essential reframe then. From shame to courage, you are doing the hard work.
You are. And finally, a provocative thought for you to carry forward. One that's designed to harness your natural empathy and apply it inward.
Okay.
Think about a time when you observed a child struggling to form a complete sentence, maybe even in their native tongue. Perhaps they mixed up tenses, or they stumbled over a complex word, or they just froze mid-sentence. Did you, in that moment, judge that child's intelligence? Did you think they were stupid because their expression was limited?
Of course not. No. You saw growth. You saw effort. You saw a brilliant mind struggling with new, complex software, and you inherently saw potential just waiting to be unlocked.
Exactly. Now, take that same reservoir of understanding, patience, and empathy that you would instantly apply to a child, and apply it fiercely and relentlessly to yourself. Appreciate that your temporary struggle is simply growth in action, and treat yourself with the compassion you deserve as you navigate this arduous process of becoming fluent.
That intellectual gap will close.
It will close, because the intelligence required to close it is already fully operational within you.
On that note of compassion, courage, and high-functioning cognitive effort, thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the psychology of language learning.
Thanks for having me.
We'll see you next time.